Because just to look at it, because you mentioned they put out all of, like, they're saying they're potentially willing to do peace. From an Israeli perspective, they see in Hamas's original charter, where they say they want a one-state solution and they say they want to kill Jews. And
right, that charter was superseded already in 2017 by what was called a political document. You know, I'm sorry to have to age myself at your expense, but I remember, I am old enough to remember when they constantly tried to discredit all of the PLO's peace initiatives by saying, what about the PLO charter? What about the PLO charter? Well, you know what? Nobody in the PLO had even read that charter after so many years. The PLO charter was from 1968. Nobody even read it. But they kept dragging it out to make excuses for why not to negotiate. There was perfect grounds to negotiate. Did the Soviet Union have to renounce the Communist Manifesto in order to negotiate with the West? When there were the nuclear test ban treaties that were signed with the Soviet Union, and the intercontinental ballistic missile treaties, and the anti-missile treaties that were signed with the U.S., was a condition for signing them that they had to denounce the Communist Manifesto? Isn't that just a completely idiotic argument? No country is obliged to renounce its founding document. The question is whether they're willing to negotiate an end to the conflict.
In today's video, we are going to take a look at accomplished historian and academic Norman Finkelstein take on the usual talking points of Zionists. The whole theme of this is basically going to be what happens when you have it a debate on knowledge versus pseudo-historical revisionism talking points. So with all that being said, enjoy the discussion. Also, special thanks to all of you who have tuned into my channel and helped me grow within the past. For days I can't even express how grateful I am towards you guys. If you guys have any questions or suggestions, please feel free to comment below and tell me. And as always, don't forget to subscribe and like the video.
To the I get what you're saying.
March,
that Israel
and then it goes in May. It keeps going back and back and back and back because Israel is simply ignoring the orders of the supreme legal body in the world.
Okay, so that you're saying that the reason why there's so many condemnations is because Israel keep ignoring it. But if we look at all the other countries, for example, North Korea, they've got 25 million people in there living under a dictatorship, a horrible regime.
Hey, dictatorships are allowed in this world. That's not illegal, a dictatorship.
So, but North Korea isn't a very good place, is it?
Hey, you know what? It's not a good place. There are very few, well, I'll grant the Scandinavian countries. There are very few good places on the planet. Unfortunately, good places are not illegal under international law.
But with North Korea, you've got this. You'll live under a life of propaganda. You live under. It's not as if it's a free.
I never said it was free. I never said it was free. I said it's not a nice place to live. I have no doubt about that. If the U.S. lifted its sanctions on North Korea, it would probably be a bearable place to live. Like in Iran, it would be a bearable place to live. Is it my cup of tea? No. But guess what? You ready for this? My government isn't my cup of tea either.
But with North Korea,
my government has the most backward health system, not just among the industrialized countries, but probably in comparison, not probably, definitely, in comparison to places like Cuba. We have the most backward health system to the point. I mean, really, it's quite an astonishing thing. When the CEO of United Healthcare Insurance was shot, I would say about 80% of Americans thought he got what was coming to him. So our country isn't a great place either. The law says nothing about that. Israel happens to be guilty of several crimes which are covered by international law.
But so is North Korea. So is North Korea, and they do very similar. They bring people up on propaganda. They brainwash people.
I'm not going to get into an argument about North Korea. A, you didn't have me on to speak about North Korea. And B, I just don't know much about it. In my youth, I was a Maoist, and the head of state of North Korea was a fellow named Kim Il-sung, who we were supposed to support because we were Maoists. I read a few books on the subject long before you were born, probably twice the time before you were born. So I'm not going to speak on North Korea. What I would say, because we should be serious, and I think you try to be serious, you make an effort. What we should be talking about is the following fact. By every metric, every available metric, Israel's crimes in Gaza are in a class all their own. There's nothing like it, not just in the 21st century. Even by some metrics, like tonnage of bombs dropped, density of destruction, there's nothing like it going back to World War II. Israel has created an apocalypse in Gaza. And bear in mind where it chose to locate the apocalypse. An area 26 miles long, 5 miles wide, repeatedly described by witnesses, including Israel's former head of the National Security Council, repeatedly described as a concentration camp. Israel has created an apocalypse targeting a concentration camp, half of whose inmates are children. So, if there is outrage and indignation at what Israel is doing, and if for a period of time this outrage and indignation dominated news headlines, it's not because, in my opinion, the international community or the international public is anti-Semitic or prejudiced against Israel. The horror that it has inflicted in Gaza is simply unspeakable. I was reading the past couple of days the new Amnesty report on Gaza. It's 300 pages, 296 pages. And it alleges, with voluminous documentation, that Israel's committing genocide in Gaza, not in the dictionary definition of genocide, but the technical legal definition based on the Genocide Convention of 1948. Israel's committing genocide in Gaza. I then last night, after finishing the Amnesty report, without missing a beat, I then turned to Lee Mordecai's report documenting the genocide in Gaza. So it seems to me there's ample reason for the international community to give disproportionate attention at this particular moment, even though it's now dropped out of the news cycle because of Syria, to give disproportionate attention to the horror that's been inflicted on this God-forsaken people who, as you know already from having read my introduction, have suffered in a concentration camp, judging by what neutral observers have said, and they were even referring to the period before Israel occupied Gaza, namely the period when it was under Egyptian administration, already back in the mid-1950s. That means 70 years. 70 years. These people have been living in a condition that has been persistently described by outside observers as a concentration camp. And now, as some people have put it, not without reason, the concentration camp since October 7th has turned into an extermination camp.
If
Now,
you don't, we might get to that later, but if you don't mind, we've got limited time, so I just want to get into the next
You mentioned the question of North Korea. Let me just give you one statistic which I found quite astonishing. A new report was put out this week by this organization called Air Wars, AIRWARS. I think it's British based. They pointed out that in the first 25 days of Israel's assault on Gaza, 1,900 children had been killed. In the darkest days of the Bashar regime, the darkest days, 2017, okay? The largest number of children killed for any 1 month during the darkest days of the Bashar regime was 239 versus 1,900 for 25 days. And then they point out, if you take the darkest year in Syria, 2017, the whole year, as many children were killed in Gaza in 25 days as were killed under Bashar al-Assad for the whole year 2017. It's an awesome, a breathtaking achievement what Israel has done to those God-forsaken people.
So the reason I brought up North Korea wasn't that we should have a whole debate on North Korea, but more as a comparison to say, there's between the Gaza and West Bank, there's 5 million people.
All right, I just made a comparison with Syria. Syria is in everyone's mind. Bashar was a butcher. Bashar was a monster. Bashar was this and Bashar was that. I'm not going to dissent. I'm not going to disagree. But I'm saying, look at the record. Compare what Israel did in 25 days, from October 7th to October 31st, to what Bashar did.
But the point is, why I'm comparing it to Russia is because of the UN, of how much they've condemned, North Korea, how much they've condemned North Korea, which have 25 million people in, compared to Gaza and North, that's 2-3 million.
I'm not going to debate. Look, I have a very firm credo. No investigation, no right to speak. I've not studied it. I'm not going to talk about it.
Okay, so let's move on then. So another quote of your book was, trapped in the vice of Israel's criminal blockade, Hamas desperately endeavored to carve out a path to normalcy. It tried diplomacy. How did they try diplomacy?
Well, I give one quote from an extensive record. In fact, there were numerous peace initiatives by Hamas trying to feel out how to solve the conflict according to international law. I'm not saying that Hamas suddenly became converted to international law. It's one of the realities of power. So let's just take a comparative example. The PLO, as you know, the Palestine, or you might not know because you're too young and I'm too old. The Palestine Liberation Organization was known as a terrorist organization in the West. Come around the early 1970s, the PLO starts gaining a certain degree of respectability among international institutions. In 1974, the head of the PLO, Yasser Arafat, he makes a famous speech at the UN. It's called The Gun or the Olive Branch, in which he says, we're giving you a choice. By 1976, and it's been exhaustively documented at this point, by 1976, the PLO is on record supporting a two-state settlement along the June 1967 borders. Does that mean that Arafat suddenly became converted to international law or UN resolutions? No. It meant that once you become a principal player on the world stage, you cannot operate outside international law, or else you are marginalized.
So Hamas never said they want a two-state solution.
Allow me to finish. Hamas won the election in 2006. It was now a responsible political party in power. And at that point, Hamas sent out many feelers, just like the PLO in the 1970s, indicated it was ready to negotiate a settlement along the June 1967 borders. However, I don't have any stake in misrepresenting the facts. The international law says that the refugees from 1947 have a right to return. Now, it is correct that Hamas had not given up on the right of return, and it had a right not to give up on the right of return, because that's the law. Amnesty International has said it. Palestinian refugees have the right to return. Human Rights Watch has said it. Palestinian refugees from 1948 have a right to return. So Hamas had indicated it was willing to settle the conflict along the terms of the two-state solution as enunciated in 1,000 by now UN resolutions, but it wasn't willing to give up on the right of return. And legally, it had the right to preserve the right of return. So I am perfectly willing to acknowledge, I said in what you read, would you mind reading it?
Sure, do you want, shall I read it again?
Yeah.
Trapped in the vice of Israel's criminal blockade, Hamas desperately endeavored to carve out a path to normalcy. It tried diplomacy.
Right, and now read what I said.
A 2009 study by a US government agency concluded that Hamas had been carefully and consciously adjusting its political program for years and had sent repeated signals that it might be ready to begin a process of coexisting with Israel.
Exactly. That's what I wrote. It said it was ready to begin a process of coexisting with Israel. It was never given a chance. I don't know what would have happened if they were at the negotiating table and whether or not Hamas would have budged on the question of the right of return. I don't know. It's a hard question for them. You know why? It's very simple. Their base is in Gaza, and 70% of the people in Gaza are refugees from 1948 or their children or their descendants. So it's very tough to give up on that right where your constituency is overwhelmingly the refugees. So it's a hard sell for them. I don't know what would have happened. What I do know for sure happened was nobody was willing to negotiate with them. nobody was willing to give them a chance. In fact, what did Israel do? Israel then launched Operation Cast Lead. It launched Operation Cast Lead. A ceasefire had been signed with Gaza in June 2008. Even the Israeli sources state the ceasefire was holding up. Who broke the ceasefire? Israel broke the ceasefire on November 5th. Israel went into Gaza and killed a half dozen militants.
I want to go back to the diplomacy, just to keep on to the question diplomacy. You said that they said they adjusting their political program to, potentially look at a peace solution. Did they ever say that they're willing to do a two-state solution?
There were many indications. I can't go through the whole record now. There was actually, I was surprised because after October 7th, some researchers who I work with started going through the whole record, and there was one after another, after another, after another indication by Hamas that it was willing to negotiate either a final solution to the question, a final settlement, or what they called a hudna, a 20-year HUDNA, a 20-year peace agreement with Israel. There were many possibilities, and if a person wants peace, what do? They test the possibilities to see what may and may not work. Israel or the United States and the United States were unwilling. They demanded complete capitulation by Hamas, which was the elected government. Remember, when the elections occurred in January 2006, Hamas didn't want to participate because it felt that the elections were part of what it called the Oslo process, and it didn't want to have anything to do with the Oslo Agreement of September 1993 because it thought that it was a capitulation by the Palestinians. It was exhorted to participate. And then it was President Bush who insisted on the elections. Because that was the era, again, you're way too young to remember, it was the era of what was called democracy promotion after the Gulf War. And so they were exhorted to participate, and they won the elections. So what? They're not allowed to take power after they won the election? And they were willing to negotiate. The record is clear on that. How the negotiations would have gone, I can't predict that.
So,
but
because
they were what?
Because just to look at it, because you mentioned they put out they're saying they're potentially willing to do peace. From an Israeli perspective, they see in Hamas's original charter where they say they want a one-state solution and they say they want to kill Jews. And
right, that charter was superseded already in 2017 by what was called a political document. I'm sorry to have to age myself at your expense, but I remember, I am old enough to remember when they constantly tried to discredit all of the PLO's peace initiatives by saying, what about the PLO charter? What about the PLO charter? Well, you know what? Nobody in the PLO had even read that charter after so many years. The PLO charter was from 1968. Nobody even read it. But they kept dragging it out to make excuses for why not to negotiate. There was perfect grounds to negotiate. Yeah, did the Soviet Union have to renounce the Communist Manifesto in order to negotiate with the West? When there were the nuclear test ban treaties that were signed with the Soviet Union, and the intercontinental ballistic missile treaties, and the anti-missile treaties that were signed with the U.S., was a condition for signing them that they had to denounce the Communist Manifesto? Isn't that just a completely idiotic argument? No country is obliged to renounce its founding document. The question is whether they're willing to negotiate an end to the conflict.
Okay, so if we ignore the manifesto and even look at the other point that you mentioned, that they were willing to have some peace deal, and you mentioned that they said they're willing to have a two-state solution.
No, I said that. Yeah, correct.
Do you know any times? Because I've never heard them say that. Have you? Do you know any times or not?
What I'm going to simply do is, I don't have all the dates before me. I would refer people to my book on Gaza, An Inquest into Its Martyrdom, where I go through a very partial list where the PLO has indicated, excuse me, I feel I'm a throwback now because there was a period in my life where I had to argue the same question with the PLO, where Hamas indicates willingness to settle the conflict or agree to a hudna, a 20-year ceasefire with Israel on the basis of international law.
Okay, so let's move on then.